This video will be a demo of my procedural content generation project as part of my game development course at the University of Staffordshire. I aimed to solve a PCG building problem. I solved it by producing a PCG system that generates a building by using modular assets which can easily be swapped out and scaled. I planned for this project by identifying the necessary elements in order to achieve it as documented in my technical design document, which can be seen here. I created a Moscow list and identified what the project should have at minimum and how far this scope could go if I had enough time. At minimum, I identified the project should have a building which has a spline which must be drawn by the user, a building which works with at least one set of modular meshes. The meshes may still need to be scaled manually by the user. There won't be any doors and all the roofs would just be flat. But then I believe that the project should have a PCG graph that generates a building that can have the meshes swapped out by taking information from a data asset, and at least some way of having a door, whether it automatically generates or use the trigger box. The project could go further by having the size and shape of the building, including numbers of floors, automatically generated to create more variety. The building could have the meshes automatically swapped out and then scaled without having to change the values manually. And the door could also be automatically placed somewhere on the front of the building. Then finally, with enough time, the project could have different shaped roofs, such as gable roofs or sloped roofs, and there could be a spline that actually generates a row of the houses in a street type thing. This is my vertical prototype that only worked with one set of modular assets, which happens to be the neoclassical set, but it only works with a specific set of values and none of them are scaled, so they happen to fit together just because they're a set of assets that were made to. But the actual shape of the buildings is automatically made, but as you can see there's a lot of diagonal lines and it creates these steppy looking walls and it doesn't look the best. And also sometimes the spline shapes did not form correctly and would cross over, but in this video I happen to get all perfectly shaped splines. It is interesting that these ones do manage to have up to 7 different sides on them, so actually creating hexagons and pentagons and stuff. But as well, the door, it must be added with the trigger box, which isn't very automatic. This is the polished prototype, where now all the splines are generated as a square or a rectangle of different sizes, because even with just squares, there's sometimes a bit of iteration, where the buildings go in and out anyway, which is slightly odd, but it works for the project and it does create interesting buildings. As you can see, I have lots of different meshes and different sets of buildings, which I've just put on different actors and I've changed the graph because all of these are now loaded in with a data asset, which creates lots of variety. Here I am swapping out the data assets. So on the actual PCG graph, there's the section for the graph settings, which has the different data assets, and I've swapped that out and it's a data asset that has information for the walls, the border for the roof, the doors, the corners of the building and everything like that. So here's some examples of some assets that I have that all nicely match. The user does also have the ability to change the values. I have set values that I think looks good in the actual blueprint, but you can change the values if you don't want your wall size to be anything, and everything will scale. It just, you have to make sure sometimes, if you do put in a value that is a bit too low or too high, you could crash the thing. So technically I should put stuff in place to stop people from saying oh, I want to make the wall 10 wide, because then it will create too many walls and it will cause issues. And also I have left it so that the roof can be individually scaled, so you do need to make sure you edit that, because I thought it's interesting if you actually want a roof border around it because you want it to be a roof garden, or whether you want it to completely match with the border, it's up to the user. The other thing I would change is that every time you change a value, it completely reconstructs the spline because the spline is on the construction script. So it would be good if I had a way of getting the seed for the spline and then saving that seed to make sure that it does not change every single time, but I would do that if I had more time. This is the first ever version of the project, which I did by following the first video by Procedural Minds for the PCG Building series. And you have to draw the spline manually, which drawing the spline manually might be something that someone wants to do. So you could technically turn off my construction script that I've made. But the other thing is there was gaps between the assets because I did not, this is before I got to actually scaling the meshes. So instead of just having the corner pieces in the corner, I had them between every single wall to fill in all of the gaps. So it does make an interesting visual, but nothing is scaled properly and it only works with this set of assets. But because originally I wanted to make a city generator, I decided to focus on making the buildings have dynamic shapes automatically so that when I had this city generator, all the buildings would automatically generate, and I wasn't focusing on the actual details of the buildings. So then my second thing that I started working on was making a spline that automatically drew a closed-in shape, and as you can see, the buildings are still the same assets and not scaled correctly. But I decided to take an interest in actually polishing the buildings because I found the tutorial actually really interesting. So what I did first was I realized, okay, I need to add data assets so that all the assets can be quickly swapped out and changed for quick variety. So I created the data asset and I followed more and more tutorials, adding more and more details from Procedural Minds playlist. Procedural Minds likes to use a lot of subgraphs, which was really helpful. So I ended up following the rest of the tutorials and adding loads of more subgraphs to make the corners, to make the ceiling, to make the roof. And then I actually wanted to take it a step further and I followed his door tutorial, but I changed it from a trigger box and I changed it and I just worked out where the front of the building was and made it so that it would find a random point on the front of the building and then just spawn there. But from following his tutorials, I did learn how to isolate basically every point on the building, which was great. Once I added all the different subgraphs and all the different bits and they were working how I wanted, I then polished up all my code and added all the comments, and as you can see it's a lot more tidy here, and now everything scales correctly as well because originally I accidentally put one of the scale bits into the transform into the offset and I was wondering why it wasn't scaling, and then I had to fix that and I broke my spline and I had to redo everything, but in the end I managed to get it fixed. And once I tidied that up, I realized, wait, I know how to isolate every single part of the building. So I started working on creating a gable roof because I worked out there's particular bits that I can isolate and I just need to add the gable bit on the front and back bit and then the slope bit on the left and right. So I worked on isolating all of the pieces. I also can't forget to mention that when following Procedural Minds tutorial, when it came to isolating the corners, it didn't isolate the corners correctly. It would isolate the front corners and it wouldn't do it at the back. It would have a weird offset. So I had to completely rewrite his corner script to isolate the corners, which I worked out, okay, we can isolate all the four walls, and what he would do is he would offset it so that it would be offset into the corner. So I had to just rewrite his code and do that myself to get everything to work, but in the end I got everything to scale with the corners in the right place and all the meshes fitting together so everything can be dynamically swapped. I had several issues when it came to making a gable type roof, which was firstly finding assets that actually fit together and finding the left and right pieces for the front of the gable that didn't, because they're always missing the back piece and it was just a pain. So I had to improvise for it, but I just wanted to demonstrate that I could do it. But at the moment it will generate correctly if the building is a perfect rectangle, but if there's any corners or any bits coming out or in, it doesn't generate correctly. And also sometimes the top doesn't generate correctly. So for now, I would say this is still like a work in progress, and I wouldn't say this is part of my polished prototype, but I did want to show it off because it was something that was really interesting, that I managed to do outside of his tutorial, and I was proud of it, but it would definitely need a lot more time and a lot more work. And also, it would be better if someone could actually make me some better modular assets because I could not find any. Okay, now for a quick overview on how to actually use the system. I will be adding a user manual in with the actual project to explain it in words. But all you have to do is go into, I actually have a world that shows off the buildings, which everything is in building PCG. But all you have to do is drag out the actor classes and it will just automatically generate the building. And then there is several different variables that if you want to change anything, you can change any of the values. But it's literally just as simple as dragging everything out because I intended it for the city building and I did want to take it further that it would just automatically place the houses with roads next to them. So it is built with that in mind. So that makes sense why everything's automatically generated, and it's not really for the designer to design buildings. It's meant to be more for actually just generating everything automatically. Thank you for taking the time to review my project. I believe I have covered the following. The problem of generating a building with modular assets, which is now fully automated, and having variety with the buildings is completely automated with the different floors and the size of the spline. And obviously I've talked in depth about what I did for the solution, and then I've shown part of my technical design document. I've shown the vertical prototype and even the first prototypes as well, and I've shown my final prototype, and I've tried to explain my development stages with explanations, and then I have tried to explain how to use the system as well. So thanks for watching.